Folks, thanks for tuning in to the latest in the Sydney Institute's virtual talks and discussions during the time of pandemic. And today we have Paul Kelly, one of Australia's best known commentators. The topic of the function today is politics and the pandemic. Now, Paul Kelly is well known to all of you who follow Australian politics, but briefly editor-at-large at The Australian and author of numerous books going back many years, most recently with Troy Bramston on the dismissal. But today Paul Kelly is going to talk to us on politics and the pandemic, and after the talk there'll be a question discussion period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerard. It's great to be back at the Sydney Institute again with Gerard and Anne Henderson talking about the politics of the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is a unique event. There has been nothing like it for a century. There is no automatic frame of reference, therefore, for governments, medical professionals, economic decision makers, business, banks, hospital administrators, media and public. Many governments and leaders have been caught by surprise and found wanting. Uncertainty dominates. We don't know if or when there will be a vaccine, if there will be a second wave, as there was a century ago with the Spanish flu, how long the economic downturn will last, or what the geostrategic consequences will be. In a sense, we're all flying blind, hostage to an enemy we still struggle to combat, with huge variations in the performance of individual countries. Treasurer Josh Frydenberg reminded us that in late February, just 10 weeks ago, the IMF was saying the virus would detract only 0.1 percentage points from global growth, that would be above 3%. Yet now we confront the worst global downturn since the Great Depression. The speed of the contagion has left everyone scrambling. In this situation, judgments about the politics are far more hazardous than normal. Let me begin with 4 overarching points. First, the war analogies are appropriate, but this war is being fought on home soil. The entire civilian population is the front line, and the measures being applied by governments at home in some ways are even more onerous than those applied at home during wartime. Second, this is a national crisis, but also an international crisis. It affects Australia and the world. It affects our relationship with the world. And ultimate victory over the virus depends not just on Australian and national efforts, but in terms of progress internationally, in terms of much of the globe. Thirdly, the challenge is to meet 2 related crises, medical and economic, knowing that the medical strategy will affect the damage to the economy, to jobs, to businesses and living standards. So there are 2 tests, 2 criteria for success, medical and economic. Fourth, in the current phase of the virus with no vaccine, the task is to manage society to contain the virus while restoring much of our economic, institutional and social life. But that means reconciling the economy and reigniting the economy with social distancing and having to live with the virus. And that is a high-risk project. On the medical front, to this point, Australia has been extraordinarily successful. The virus has claimed more than 250,000 deaths worldwide. In Australia, there have been 96 deaths. In the United States, there are more than 71,000 people who died, greater than the total number of Americans who were killed during the entire period of the Vietnam War. In the UK, there are nearly 30,000 deaths. In Canada, often compared with Australia, there are more than 4,000 deaths. Adjusted for population, the death toll in America is 46 times that of Australia. Britain is 96 times as great, Canada 20 times as large. We should not belittle our achievements here. Professor Jodie McVernon, one of the directors at the Doherty Institute and a co-opted member of the medical panel advising the National Cabinet, said to me last week, "We have averted a catastrophe. You only have to look at New York, London and Spain. To claim we didn't need to implement these measures is at best naive and at worst malicious. I think in Australia we don't appreciate what we have been spared. We have not lived in a situation where we've used ice rinks as makeshift morgues or seen refrigerated trucks outside hospitals. We are not special. We are all human, and this virus is what it is." Unquote. Our medical performance on the evidence is one of the best in the world. 3 factors drove this. We started early. The politicians and the medical advisors agreed on a strategy and they followed it, unlike the situation in the US and the UK. And we had a national cabinet as an overarching decision-making body promoting consistent and usually consensus-based decisions. Though that didn't happen all the time, it did happen much of the time. The key steps here were as follows. The 21st January decision by the Chief Medical Officer, Brendan Murphy, to exercise his powers under the Biosecurity Act and declare a pandemic. That alerted the government and it involved the Prime Minister right from the start. Second, the 1 February decision to impose the China travel ban, a decision criticised by China, at odds with the World Health Organization and provoking alarm and concern from the university sector and the travel sectors. Britain and Canada did not follow Australia on that ban. Health Minister Greg Hunt said, "That decision bought Australia at least a month while we were putting everything else into place. That is, acquiring the ventilators and the ICU hospital capacity." Third, on 15 March, the National Cabinet met for the first time, a meeting Scott Morrison called historic. The Cabinet was serviced by the Australian Health Protection Principles Committee, containing the medical officers of the Commonwealth and the states. Learning from the bushfires, Morrison was determined to achieve a functioning federation acting on a single source of medical advice. The strategy was to manage both the health and economic dimensions of the crisis simultaneously. Australia decided on a middle path strategy, a suppression strategy. It did not follow New Zealand in its elimination goal, attempting to eradicate the virus altogether, nor did it follow other countries, Sweden preemptively and preeminently, in allowing much of their normal economic and social life to continue. The medical results show in per capita terms Australia has been as successful as New Zealand in managing the virus, while Sweden's death rate is 70 times that of Australia. Sweden is no model for Australia in this crisis. The 3 key figures in Australia's success to this stage at the medical level have been Morrison, Greg Hunt and Brendan Murphy. Morrison's performance as Prime Minister has been of a very high order. It's not mistake-free, that would be impossible, but his judgments have been sound, his strategy was well-based, he displayed both strong leadership and a capacity to hold the country together. This has been so far a success, I believe, for Australian governance and for the quality of medical advice, although there have been a couple of really conspicuous failures, witness the Ruby Princess. Let me now move to the economics. On the 10th of March, Morrison outlined the 7 principles that would guide the government's response. The economic response has seen the government operating in an emergency setting. It has taken bold decisions and it has responded to a rolling crisis. The upshot has been 3 fiscal packages. On the 12th of March, a $17.6 billion economic support package. On the 22nd of March, the second support package totalling $66 billion, called by Josh Frydenberg the Team Australia moment. And then on the 30th of March, the $130 billion wage subsidy or JobKeeper package. A total fiscal spend of $313 billion or 10% of GDP. This is easily the largest and fastest fiscal emergency response seen in this country since World War II. Treasury estimated that without this fiscal response, unemployment would have reached 15%. It currently estimates that the unemployment level will top 10%. This is an extremely damaging outcome. But if this unemployment peak is in fact reached at 10%, it will still be below the 11% unemployment recorded in the recession of the early 1990s. The aim of the JobKeeper package was to keep business and employees formally connected. It was designed as a mega hit to show the public and markets and business the government was ready to take unprecedented action to save the economy and try to preserve a framework for recovery. Its psychological impact was therefore important. It was designed to hold out a prospect of hope. Frydenberg reveals that stage 3 came when Treasury felt the economic restrictions could see GDP fall 10 to 12% in the June quarter. Critically, if Australia had followed much of Europe, and it did not, and imposed an 8-week lockdown, the adverse impact on GDP could have doubled to 24% in the June quarter. Frydenberg said, "This was the cliff we were standing on at the time." The government in fact acted to prevent a depression-type scenario. This came at a time when the tougher social distancing policies were approved by the National Cabinet, closing down significant elements of the economy. A feature of the economic response has been coordination between the government and the Reserve Bank. And on 19 March, the Governor, Philip Lowe, announced a support package. He cut the cash rate to 0.25% and signalled it would stay there for a number of years. In addition, we saw a $105 billion bank government package to preserve liquidity, help businesses and households in what the Governor called a financial bridge to cover an economic chasm. The bank would engage in a bond buying program and a line of credit to the private banks. Frydenberg said it revealed a collective effort, a collective will to do whatever it takes to save the economy. The economic response has been highlighted by a number of features. First, it revealed Morrison and Frydenberg were pragmatists, prepared to respond to an emergency situation with radical interventionist measures. I believe their spending response is justified given the scale of the threatened economic downturn. Second, this saw a close and trusting operational relationship between the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, between the Ministers and the Treasury Department under Stephen Kennedy, and between the bank and the government after a lot of tension between them in 2019. Third, it revealed the private banks playing a constructive role in the provision of finance, also of course designed to resurrect their reputation after the Royal Commission and the difficulties over the last several years. Fourth, it showed the Labor Party acting responsibly in terms of voting the packages in the Parliament. Politically, Labor, I believe, had no option. It is significant, however, that Labor wanted the government to spend a lot more to extend the JobKeeper program to 1 million casual workers. So Labor's stance from the start was for the government to move more quickly on the health measures and then engage in a faster and bigger economic stimulus. I think this position of the Labor Party will not worry the Morrison government at all. Fifth, the government negotiated successfully with the ACTU on aspects of the design, raising the possibility, or possibly the false hope, of further cooperation with the ACTU down the track. Sixth, it's noteworthy the government, however, did put limits on how far it would go. It refused to take an equity stake in Virgin because it wanted to avoid bailing out individual companies. And having spent $213 billion, it declined to spend more on more casuals, as the Labor Party demanded. Let me make some observations about the politics. Crisis usually helps incumbents. This has happened with both Morrison and the Premiers. The National Cabinet has given the Premiers a profile they normally don't enjoy. The most recent news poll shows Morrison's approval rating at 68 to 28%, compared with a deficit 10 weeks earlier of 37 to 59%. Surely the most dramatic turnaround in news poll history on an approval for a Prime Minister. The parties are shown by news poll to be running at 50-50, pretty much the 2019 election result. But in my view, the polls understate the real coalition position, a function of it being seen as the party of more reliable and trusted economic performance, a factor that is displayed in any actual vote on election day. Federal Labor under Anthony Albanese is worried about being marginalised. The operation of the National Cabinet, containing Liberal and Labor incumbents, only accentuates this problem. Morrison leads Albanese on the Better Prime Minister measure, 56 to 28%. However, things will become more challenging for the government as we re-enter what might be called the recovery phase, when we face very high levels of unemployment, possibly around 10%, as the Treasury has indicated, and we face the challenge of running a COVID-safe economy with the contradiction this implies. The government has designed measures to be targeted and temporary. Many, like JobSeeker, have a sunset clause, but withdrawing these benefits will be hard. Labor and many interest groups are likely to oppose this, and of course, withdrawing such benefits at high levels of unemployment will be particularly difficult. So the government will need to reassess and recalibrate on some of these challenges and on some of these measures. The government's main task, as Morrison keeps saying, is to ensure there is no second wave of the virus. He said, and I quote, "If you ease off too quickly, too early, then you end up making the situation even worse," unquote. And he means even worse in both a health and economic sense. However, Morrison and Frydenberg are now extremely anxious to begin economic restoration, with Frydenberg saying this week that every week the shutdown continues costs the economy an extra $4 billion in economic activity. This is designed to put pressure on everyone, including the Premiers, to make the shift and reignite the economy. National Cabinet on Friday is expected to define the framework and the conditions to reignite the economy. But individual Premiers will have the discretion to move according to their own timetable. Morrison has made the point that individual Premiers will carry the political responsibility for what happens in their own state. It's interesting to note that Morrison continues his very strong campaign to have the schools back, to have pupils back in the schools and the teachers back in the schools. And you can see why. Because the latest Treasury estimates reveal how important the schools are in terms of GDP and the role that the schools play in a functioning economy. On the other side of the crisis, we face a new world. And let me finish with a few concluding observations about the politics of the new world. Australia, like all countries, will face a massive debt burden and extremely high budget deficits. So the question is, what will be the economic strategy to manage this? Morrison and Frydenberg have already made clear that their approach will be to manage the high debt and deficits not by austerity, not by spending cuts, but by economic growth. This, in fact, is the strategy that Morrison employed as Treasurer to handle a far less significant budget deficit several years ago. The challenge, however, will be significant, and there will be a lot of pressure from various parts of the community to increase taxation in order to manage the debt and deficits. It's not surprising, therefore, that both Morrison and Frydenberg have preemptively indicated that their strategy will not be to increase taxation. One of the interesting features will be to look at what Labor says. Labor went to the last election with significant increases in taxation across the board, and there will be very significant pressure from the centre-left of politics, from the progressive side of politics, to handle debt and deficits by increasing taxation. So tax policy will be a big theme on the other side. So will the question of government resources. There is going to be enormous pressure from a number of quarters and a number of interest groups on government spending. It's very clear that there will be an imperative on the health side to ensure that we have adequate health arrangements, and not just adequate health arrangements in terms of all the provisions for meeting a future pandemic, but also arrangements in terms of the supply side to ensure that we have adequate resources here in terms of medical equipment, ventilators, and other important health equipment. There will be pressure on the welfare side for significant welfare spending, given the economic situation. Given the more dangerous geopolitical situation, I think there will be clearly pressure to increase defence spending, and there will clearly be very significant pressures for the government to play a role of sorts in terms of nation building and reconstruction. So clearly one of the themes will be, from this situation of a very significant budget deficit, ongoing and competing pressures on the government in terms of future spending. And I think we'll see those pressures playing out both within the government itself and between the government and the Labor Party. The next question is, what will be the recovery strategy? And here we've seen Morrison and Frydenberg indicate to a certain extent the government's recovery strategy. That is, it wants it to be business-led, it wants it to be based on enhanced productivity, it's looking at maintaining an open and competitive economy, not going for protectionist pressures. So I think all these will be important ingredients. In fact, Frydenberg has gone so far as to say that the coalition will be guided in the future by the same values and principles that's guided its reforms in the past. In other words, there'll be continuity. Now, I think there'll be a lot of pressure, of course, for discontinuity. There are many people saying that the world is different, the world has changed, governments have therefore got to have a different approach with different priorities. The central economic and political challenge facing both the government and Labor will be to reduce unemployment from very high levels of around 10%. what will be the Morrison-Frydenberg agenda, what will be the Labor agenda, and in many ways this will be the central issue at the next election. Labor, I think, will invoke its history, in particular its history coming off the 1940s and World War II, when it put in place the theme of post-war reconstruction. And I think you can already see signs from senior Labor figures that Labor will attempt to take charge and take command of the agenda in terms of a national reconstruction phase. I think in terms of my final points, that there will be some interesting cultural changes at work. I think one of the cultural changes will be that we'll have a greater emphasis on community cooperation and public institutions over individual liberty, individual autonomy and individual narcissism. I think that there will be a new emphasis on social cooperation and effective public institutions, particularly health institutions and health care. I think that there will be a greater sense of individual vulnerability, and this means a deeper awareness of community interdependence and mutual support in family, workplace and industry, along with the need to resurrect a virtuous civic culture, well-run and well-funded healthcare institutions, and a business culture that prioritises respect for employees. I think both sides of politics will attempt to capture the vibes around this particular change in values and change in community culture. I think one of the challenges facing the coalition will be internal critiques, and I do see an alternative position being developed now on the coalition side of politics from both economic libertarians and people you might loosely call conservative populists. They are starting to criticise the Morrison government, saying that Morrison has fundamentally misread the situation, that there was no need for such an important response on the health side, that he exaggerated the dangers of the virus, having exaggerated the dangers of the virus and engaging in a very significant economic shutdown, he was then forced into emergency fiscal stimulus measures of a scale that he didn't need, and that therefore the government's ended up with a debt situation and a deficit situation that's very much of its own making and was not justified. To the extent that this develops as a strong critique of the government from its own side of politics and from its own supporters, this could be a significant development over the next couple of years. And I'll close things off there. Thank you very much. It's been very good to talk with you on this subject.
Many thanks to Paul Kelly for a first-rate summary and analysis, and now we come to questions and discussion, and some of our members have sent in questions and we'll deal with them in the process. Thank you. Paul, thanks for a first-class analysis. So I'll bring you on to a point about China first, but talking about the Prime Minister, as you were in your speech and you were praiseworthy of his efforts, it seems it's not so long ago that sections of the media were referring to Scotty from marketing, but Scotty from marketing seems to have gone into another business. And how do you see that development?
I think that much of the media has underestimated Scott Morrison. One of the extraordinary things they say about him is that we don't know a lot about the Prime Minister. Well, the point to make about Scott Morrison is he served as Immigration Minister, a Social Security Minister, and then Treasurer for 3 years. And the experience in each of those portfolios has been fundamental to the way he operates as Prime Minister. This is a really rich data source on what Morrison is actually like. And I think his performance so far over the course of the past 10 weeks, in the course of this crisis, indicates that there's a lot more to him than simply marketing skills. I've argued that I think the performance of the government in recent times, in terms of the magnitude of the decisions and the speed of the decisions, has been the most significant period of decision-making by a national government since World War II.
So, going back to the Prime Minister, as you pointed out in your talk, we closed the border with China well ahead of advice from the World Health Organization, and that caused certain problems. So, and then since then there have been other issues with the Australia-China relationship. Now I know you've written about this, but how do you see this long-term Australia-China relationship? Well, firstly, the Australia-China relationship, and then China's place in the world, presumably after the pandemic, but also during the pandemic.
Well, I think the pandemic will accentuate and deepen the polarisation about China. So I think it's pretty clear that relations between the United States and China will deteriorate further, and I think that nations are increasingly going to be driven into a bipolar world, looking at the Chinese model on the one hand and the American model on the other hand. This virus originated in China, so China has a responsibility in terms of the global consequences. I think it is important that there be an inquiry, but there can't be an effective inquiry unless China cooperates. So there is a conundrum there as well. I think that we need to bear in mind that even before we had the eruption of the virus, we had a very assertive China over the last several years, both in terms of the South China Sea, its military agenda, its defence budget, its assertion of soft power, and it's presenting itself to many countries in the developing world as a superior model to Western democracy. So this is a comprehensive competition between the United States and China in terms of models, in terms of governance, trade, economy, technology and strategy, and Australia will be increasingly caught up in this competition.
In relation to that, as you were saying, that there were tensions in the relationship before, but the tensions seemed to, before the pandemic, but they've greatly increased, as you know, with this very extraordinary attack by the by China's ambassador in Canberra against the government. So it seems that not only in Australia but also elsewhere, that China's representatives in the world have become very aggressive. In a sense, they're in denial, but they're more than in denial, they're also attacking. Now that may just be something that they're doing because they want to do it. Some have suggested that they're trying to cover themselves with their own population, but it may just be a continuation of what was going on before the pandemic. How do you see that?
There's no doubt that China's diplomacy around the world has been conspicuously aggressive. We've seen that play out in Australia with the comments of the Chinese ambassador in recent times. I think this is extremely counterproductive for China, and I think the collective impact of the virus and of Chinese diplomacy will have a profound effect on Australian public opinion. Australians don't like to be bullied, and if they think there is a major power attempting to bully them, and that's how it looks at the moment, this will not play out well with the Australian public. Now, perhaps China doesn't care about that, but the Australian government will certainly have to take into account public opinion in terms of its own management of relations with China. I think the government is still attempting to implement the Howard model here. And the Howard model is attempting to maintain effective relations with both America and China. And frankly, that I think is what we have to do. It's getting more difficult, there's no doubt about that, given China's more assertive position and given Donald Trump in the White House. But we must attempt to do this, and that means I think we've got to try and cool the climate. I think the Australian government, and essentially I think this is Morrison's position, needs to treat China in a cool, realistic, but tough-minded way.
As you know, we are dependent on China for our economic growth to some extent, but also, as you also know, the fact that China is dependent on Australia is often overlooked. Sometimes not expressed as fully as it might be by our political leadership, sometimes not reflected in commentary. But how do you get out that message that a lot of China's growth in recent years has come out of Australia's mineral exports, and without those mineral exports coming from a high quality supplier in a orderly legal system, China's growth wouldn't have been as easy as it has been. So how do we get that message out?
Well, I think this is a very important message, and it reflects the mutually beneficial nature of the trade and economic relationship between Australia and China. And I think in the current environment, that can often be overlooked because there is a lot of emotionalism in the public debate in this country about China, and that's not a good thing. We need to get rid of the emotionalism, we need to get rid of the inflamed rhetoric, and of course a lot of the inflamed rhetoric does come from the Chinese side, and try and settle things down and have a more realistic debate. And the truth here is, despite what China says, I don't think China wants to make some fundamental change to the economic or trade partnership. Why would they? Because it's in China's interests. So therefore we need to look at the reality which sits underneath a lot of the rhetoric and try and focus a lot more on the reality, and not just the reality, but the opportunities which will continue to exist economically as we see China continue to grow, maybe not grow quite as strongly in the future as it has in the past, but there's still going to be enormous economic opportunities for China in terms of the partnership, in terms of the economic partnership between both countries, and we need to keep that up there in lights as well as be alert to the strategic rivalry.
So does that require any change in Australia's relationship with the United States?
Well, I think we've got to continue to operate within the traditional framework with America, but changes will be needed. Now, when I talk about the traditional framework, I'm talking about the alliance relationship with the United States, the long history, the momentum, the cordial and trusted relationship between the two countries. So that goes on, and the point to make about that is that that transcends individual politicians sitting in Parliament House and sitting in the White House. I think the strength of the Australian-American alliance does transcend individual politicians. Having said that, things are changing. And I think Donald Trump represents a fundamental change, not just in terms of Donald Trump, but in terms of American politics and the sort of presidents we see after Trump. So Trump has talked about putting America first. He wants allies to do a lot more. I think his attitude to China is he's prepared to take trade retaliation against China, but there is a question mark about the extent to which he is prepared to really challenge China strategically. So the takeout from all this, I think, is that we need to do everything we can to preserve the strategic relationship with the United States, but we have to do more. We have to become more self-reliant within the alliance. We have to become a country which is more resilient, which spends more than 2% of GDP on defence. We've got to take the defence budget up to 2.5% of GDP if we can. We've got to try and make that bipartisan. And there's no point talking about a more dangerous world in geostrategic terms and talking about what China's doing if we're not prepared to back up these comments and back up this analysis with hard-headed decisions when it comes to national resilience and national defence.
When I hear you say that, and when I heard you talk about, on the Conservative side of politics, demand for a greater sense of nationalism in the economy, it reminded me a bit of what the late Bob Santamaria used to say, and what the late Frank Knoffelmarker and other anti-communists used to say. They used to say, we want to be allies with the United States, we can't really trust them. They've got their own interests, we've got our interest. We should increase our defence expenditure, and we should be more self-sufficient as an economy, and we should be more protected. So is it the return of the sort of 1960s and 1970s anti-communists, do you think?
Well, you've really nailed me there, Gerard, suggesting there might be a parallel between what I'm saying now and what Bob Santamaria...
But it's not just you, it's also Hugh White. I mean, Hugh White's saying we've got to spend more on defence.
Well, look, I used to always enjoy watching Santamaria on Point of View, and I think it's fair to say in those days I tended to disagree with him a lot of the time, although not all the time. But the reality is that there was a fundamental truth in what Santamaria said. You could disagree with him about the degree to which he wanted more money spent on defence. But Santamaria's argument was always an argument based on the strategic risks and dangers that Australia faced. And let's be very clear, given the state of the world and the state of the region and the rise of China, such risks are very apparent today. And there is no point people simply talking about risks without being prepared to engage in policy prescriptions to address this. Now, I think this is going to be a very difficult issue for the Morrison government, given that the budget will be in significant deficit, will have a lot of debt, and there are going to be a lot of education and welfare demands on spending. But we can't overlook the argument for greater national resilience.
Coming back from China as a nation to Australia as a nation, its relationship with China, and as you know, I think something like 10% of Australians have some sort of ethnic link with China, some very direct, and as you know, the Chinese-Australian community is divided. Some support the government in Beijing, many don't support the government in Beijing. How do you think this is going to be handled at the time of what you spoke about, an increasing resentment within the Australian community to the government in China because of the way it's handled the pandemic?
Well, this is going to be a challenging issue for Australia, and I note here that Morrison says all the time when he's talking about China, he draws the distinction between what is the attitude of Australia towards the communist government in Beijing on the one hand, and then the attitude of Chinese Australians on the other. And he's been at pains to praise the performance and outlook of Chinese Australians during the course of the virus in terms of internal behaviour and so on, and taking measures to protect the country against the virus. We've got to ensure that attitudes to China don't lead to more racial and racist incidents in this country. I think that's something we've got to be vigilant about. Now, clearly, I think there's a great degree of tolerance in this country, but on the margins, every now and again, you see some sort of breakout, and we've got to be careful about that. And of course, we've got a fundamental problem here with China, with Beijing, given its attitude. And its attitude is, of course, that all Chinese people anywhere in the world have got an allegiance to China and to the Chinese government. And this is a real point of difficulty and conflict. And there's no doubt that Australia's security and defence organisations have focused on this in recent times, looking at the extent of Chinese penetration of this country, and to a certain extent that penetration of Australia is designed to exploit the Chinese Australian community. Which is much
deeper than the attempt by the old Soviet Union to do it, because that turned on a Communist Party and fellow travellers of the Communist Party, whereas this influence extends through universities and to some extent schools, with the nation trying to maintain the view that the loyalty of Australian citizens is primarily in the first place to that nation. So it's a more serious problem than the Soviet communism was in a decade or so, decades ago. So in relation to, we've had some questions here from people sending them in. So international students are obviously affected by this ban, and the universities have been affected by this ban, and then many of those international students are Chinese students, and we don't quite know to what extent that will continue, partly because we don't know to what extent the Chinese government might try to block it, or to what extent the China, being not as wealthy as it was, the parents of these students can't afford it. So where do the universities sit in all this?
Well, I think that's a difficult question to assess at the moment for the reasons that you have identified. We know that the universities are extremely financially dependent on international students, which is now a very significant export industry for Australia. I think there's been a price to pay for this in terms of the quality of education at universities, and this is an issue that I think will get increasing attention. So I think that we'll have to wait and see, but I think there will be an appraisal, there will be a reappraisal here of university policy and university strategies off the back of the crisis, just as we're going to see a reappraisal in so many different parts of our economy and society.
So before we get back to that point, let's go back to the National Cabinet. And as you know, in Australia, we never had a national government in the First War or the Second War, partly because in the Second War, the Labor Party was opposed to it. It wasn't really raised in the First War. And now we've got a National Cabinet, which is not really a cabinet, but it consists of all the leaders of the various cabinets in the various governments. And you sort of praise that, but how do you think that's working? I mean, is it capable of working? Some of our people phoning in have asked us, will it take the place of COAG? What's your view on that?
Well,
or the COAG being the Commonwealth government, the Commonwealth and States governments meeting together. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly the ambition of the Prime Minister that the National Cabinet continue to exist. I think while he hasn't said this, he would like to make it permanent. Now, whether that's possible or not, we don't know. But I think his ambition would be to have the National Cabinet replace COAG. Now, there might be a reasonably good chance of this happening, because I think one of the takeouts from the National Cabinet so far is that it seems to be very much in the interests of the premiers. The premiers like it. The premiers are more important as a result of National Cabinet than they were before. They've got a much higher profile. They are engaged in national decision making in a way they weren't before. And to a certain extent, the National Cabinet assists incumbents. The real challenge is, how does it function beyond this particular crisis, and whether it can endure and be seen to be beneficial and constructive after the crisis. But I think that an attempt will be made to institutionalise the National Cabinet and keep it going.
So to what extent is it different? Because as you know, at COAG, at the end of a COAG meeting, they all go into Parliament House and all the premiers line up with the Prime Minister in the middle and the senior ones next to him and the less senior ones in terms of longevity as Premier on the outside. So what's the difference between what's happening now and a normal COAG meeting which ends up in a joint press conference?
Well, the difference is that the decision making is fundamentally more significant in the National Cabinet, because what had happened to COAG over the last several years, it had tended to be fairly bureaucratic. It would meet a couple of times a year. It would take one-off decisions of somewhat dubious implementation capacity. What's happening now is the National Cabinet is focused on the fundamental and high-profile decisions facing the country, and it's having a say in those decisions. Now, you correctly say, Gerard, that it's not a cabinet the way we understand a cabinet to be, and it can't be like that. It's a different sort of cabinet. So it's taking a different sort of decision. It's taking, if you like, framework decisions, the implementation of which and timing of which is often implemented by individual premiers in their own state according to their own discretion, but nonetheless there is a framework and there is a consistency there. And I think the really fascinating thing will be how the National Cabinet functions in the recovery phase and the extent to which they can actually take economic decisions, broad-based economic decisions, which relate to the country in terms of recovery. I mean, that's going to be very tricky and very difficult, but it will be fascinating to watch.
But as of today, as you pointed out in your speech, on the crucial issue, really, which the government regards as the crucial issue in terms of economic recovery of getting the schools back, you've got one significant two holdouts, the Victorian Premier and the ACT in Canberra, the ACT Chief Minister. They're significant, they're both Labor leaders, they're significant holdouts. And the argument is, to what extent are they being motivated by the teacher unions and the principals unions? So that is one area where there's a kind of glossed over unity, but underneath it there's disunity to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, some schools are pretty well back, some are coming back slowly, and then you've got the holdouts of Victoria and the Australian Capital Territory.
Well, this demonstrates the point again that it's not a proper functioning cabinet. You can't get away from the politics. This is a cabinet which contains Liberal and Labor leaders. So it's a cabinet in which there are very significant differences of outlook, and this has come to the fore in relation to schools. A couple of points to make here. It's been fascinating to see how hard Morrison is pushed on the schools issue. He wants those schools back. He is completely convinced of the medical advice, and he understands that the economic dividends from getting schools back are really significant. On the other hand, you've had some of the Labor premiers, in particular Dan Andrews in Victoria, has a different view about this, a different view about easing the economic shutdown, and clearly a very different view about schools. And one of the, I think, underreported aspects about all this has been the role of the teachers' unions and the teachers' federations. I'm surprised we haven't seen greater media analysis looking at the exact nature of the influence here, the channels of influence, but it is extraordinary that the teachers' federations have been essentially, I'm talking now about the Teachers' Federation in Victoria, have been essentially opposed to reopening schools. And they talk a lot about equity. Well, we know who's being hurt. The students being hurt are those from a lower socio-economic background. So I do find it surprising there has not been a greater emphasis on this question.
So going back on that point, we're getting close to the end now. I mean, as you know, I mean, as you make the point, the teachers are holding out in the government schools, but they are teachers who are at home on full salaries paid by the taxpayer. And take you back to some of your early comments in your talk about post-war reconstruction after the Second World War, but also the Great Depression. Now, as you know, in the Great Depression, everyone took a cut. I mean, we had a national wages system then, but wages were reduced across the board. Everyone took a cut. There was deflation to some extent, so the cut may not have been as great as it seemed, but everyone took a cut. Now, as you know, at this time you seem to have a divide between the public sector, in a sense, for good reasons, has closed down industries. But you've got a situation where the public sector is in effectively permanent secure employment without a wage cut, and the people who are copying it are essentially in the private sector, or else their parents, and as you pointed out, the ones who are copying it are lower socioeconomic parents, parents with children with disabilities, parents who are not well educated that they can educate their own children. So how do you see us overcoming this apparent public sector, private sector divide? Well,
again, I think this is a difficult issue. I'm a little bit surprised that it hasn't become more of an issue after, say, 10 weeks than what it is. But if in fact the economic tribulations last for a considerable period of time, and they might, then I think this will become a more important source of tension. Now, I think it's very difficult for the Morrison government because if we look at the National Cabinet, there is no way you could get a decision from the National Cabinet to restrain or reduce or cut back public sector wages, because not all the premiers would agree with that when it comes to the state public service. And so you've got the state public service, you've got the Commonwealth public service, and of course any such decisions would have a lot of political consequences in terms of public sector employees and how they felt about that and how they responded to that. Nonetheless, it's certainly true that the burden at the moment in terms of unemployment, in terms of reduced income, in terms of dire impacts on living standards, is being overwhelmingly carried by the private sector. So I think there is a question here of equity, and as we go along over coming months, it may well be that more and more tensions arise in terms of this difference between the public and private sector on the equity front. We usually have the Labor Party making equity arguments, but what we might see in this particular case is the Conservative side of politics starting to make these equity arguments.
Now, of course, it's equity, as you pointed out, but it's equity plus, because, as you know, I mean, action has been taken, and it's very often affected the most entrepreneurial section of the Australian economy, people who want to set up their own businesses, which might have grown into big businesses. In any event, they're employing people at this stage. So then you've got the situation where people who are, I don't want to be unkind to the Department of Infrastructure, but they're probably writing notes to one another, whereas outside people are employing people, then their business have had to close down. So it's concern about the entrepreneurial section of the Australian society. I mean, if it's crushed, it's going to take a long time to come back.
It's important to note that the Morrison government keeps saying it wants the recovery to be led by business, not government. Now, that's easier said than done, and this may end up being a very significant point of difference between the government and Labor. What will Labor's strategy be for recovery? To what extent will Labor be saying, no, we would like to see recovery being led by both government and business? I mean, I'm not certain what Labor will decide, but I just put that up there as a possible area of difference and dispute. But this goes to the question then of the recovery policies. Morrison and Frydenberg want business to lead the recovery. Well, that means they've got to put in place the policies that enable that to happen. The incentives on the tax side, on the industrial relations side, in terms of workplace training. So the question is whether they can put those policies in place. Can they get them up? Can they sell them? Can they legislate them? And to what extent we'll see then a fundamental difference in policy terms, not just strategic terms, between the government and Labor. So the idea of a business-led recovery is the natural thing and the right thing for the Liberal Party to say. But actually implementing this could prove to be a pretty challenging project.
One final question. One of our members sent this in and said, look, she loves the relative harmony between politicians at this stage, and she wonders whether this will continue, which I guess is, to reframe the question, is when we are able to go back to holding hands and hugging, for those who want to do this, will all the politicians be holding hands and hugging, or we go back to the relative conflict in Australian society? It's not as dramatic as other places, but will we go back to a political conflict soon or ever?
I think, in theory, there are three options here, Gerard. One is whether we'll see, if you like, the more consensus-based operations at the moment continue. If you like, the sort of consensus atmosphere that surrounds the National Cabinet. Now, I don't think that will in fact continue as we get to the recovery phase. Another option is to say we will go back to the poisonous political polarisation that we've seen over the course of the past decade, which has made it incredibly difficult to get up national interest reform-based policies. And this has been very significant, I think, in the diminished quality of public policy in Australia. The fact is, there's been far too much political conflict. The political conflict has been damaging, it's been poisonous, and it's been very hard to get up reform. So the second option is, will we go back to that? There is perhaps a compromise middle position. And perhaps I'm being too optimistic about this, but the middle position might be that we return to competitive politics with a lot of rivalry in the system, but nonetheless, given the challenges facing the country, very high level of unemployment, we do see more cooperation and more bipartisanship at an incremental level than what we've seen for the past decade. So in general terms, I see those as being the three options. And one can take one's pick, and we'll have to see what happens.
Well, Paul, I think at a time of pandemic, it's always good to end on an optimistic note. So let's end there, and thanks for a great presentation today. And we'll keep reading you in the Australian of a weekday and the weekend Australian on Saturday.
Thanks. It's been great to be at the Sydney Institute. It's been great to be at the Sydney Institute again.
Thanks, Bill.